the Marathas to comprehend what resources individual chiefs commanded, let alone their motivation or numbers of their allies. Shanti, Shanti, Om. The East India Company could never reliably estimate the number of men the Sikh chiefs commanded. William Franklin, the authority of a Sikh informant whom he met in the 1793-94 campaign in Panipat, estimated the combined forces of the Sikh chiefs to number 248,000. George Forster, traveling through the Punjab hills in the late 18th century, put the figure at 200,000 cavalry. Some years later, George Thomas, an Irish adventurer who briefly created his own chiefdom in Haryana, claimed that the core cavalry of the Sikh chiefs could not exceed 64,000. Thomas, however, admitted that an accurate account was not possible since the force of each chief was usually an aggregate of various smaller units of cavalry maintained by independent commanders. Thomas also remarked that the pattern of raiding for which the Sikhs were feared arose from the method by which the Sikh soldier was paid. The sardars, or the heads of various units of cavalry, were not permanently bound to any chief, and would frequently fight for different missals. Forster confirmed this view, noting that the great demand for military labor forced the Sikh chiefs to distribute a certain share of this property to their soldiers, who, on any cause of dissatisfaction, made no hesitation in quitting their service and following a more popular leader. Military service was an important form of employment for Khalsa peasant soldiers by the late 18th century, and was certainly not limited to employment by other Sikhs. Sikh participation in the pre-colonial military labor market outside the Punjab is well documented. Sikh chiefs from Malwa often entered into contractual alliances with other military groups. The contract signed with the Marathas in 1785 assured the Sikhs a jagir worth of rupees 1 million, 1 million, in lieu of military service. Additionally, it provided Sikh sardars with a per diem maintenance payment of 8 annas for each horseman registered on the muster roll. Before the raid at Chandausi, the Daliwalia and Nishanwalia missals from Malwa were allied with Zabita Khan, the Rohilla Afghan chief who had rebelled against the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam. Several times, the minister of the emperor sent envoys to the Sikh chiefs, promising them an annual payment of rupees 700,000 to join the Mughal forces. While traveling in the Punjab hills, Forster mentions seeing bands of mercenary Sikhs in the employment of the Rajput ruler of Jammu, Jai Mata Di. Their proven skills in raiding, managing forces, and engaging in successful combat enhanced the Sikhs' reputation and payment potential in the military labor market. It also tided them through scarce times when other sources of income had dried up. To successfully command other Sikhs or negotiate with groups such as the Marathas or the English, Sikh chiefs had to convey several characteristics other than a reputation as formidable warriors. When negotiating as the commanders of armies, it became necessary to demonstrate the loyalty they commanded from their own men, as well as the strong alliances they shared with other chiefs. At a time when disputes among the Sikh chiefs could easily be ascertained by intelligencers and news writers who had access to the Sikh courts and camps, diplomatic efforts by the chiefs served to present themselves as a cohesive brotherhood of warriors. It was for these reasons that despite the continuing competition and feuds among themselves, Sikh chiefs were able to protect an image of fraternal solidarity. They understood that outside of Punjab, their status as a group could not be negotiated through a single chief acting on his own. The actions of the group as a collective would determine the way in which Sikhs would be judged by potential allies and rivals. The independence of Sikh chiefs and commanders and their insistence on being treated with dignity due to sovereign rulers rather than as mercenaries made their forays into the military labor market unpredictable. During the Chandausi campaign, several messages were sent between the Maratha leaders and the Sikh chiefs. The Marathas proposed that the Sikhs join their forces at a subordinate level to help them gain more territory in the north. A treaty concluded between the Maratha general Ambaji and Ramgarhia, Karor Singhia, and Dalewalia chiefs on March 31, 1785 reveals the unequal terms of the treaty. The Sikh chiefs were to give up all claims to Rakhi in the Trans-Yamuna area and join the Maratha expedition in return to 1/3 of any acquisition made by their combined parties. It is important to keep in mind that the Chandausi raids followed the devastating Chalisa famine, and the Malwa chiefs had to reluctantly agree to the treaty. That the treaty committed them to less plunder for roughly the same amount of work reflects their weaker position. Perhaps fearing the long-term consequences of this treaty, the Sikh chiefs 2 months later secretly approached the British resident Colonel Cummings and the Nawab of Awadh, offering to put a force of 30,000 Sikh cavalry at their disposal for better terms than those offered by the Marathas. When neither alliance proved satisfactory, the raid of the Sikhs continued. Although individually the Malwa chiefs had smaller armies, collectively their forces were a formidable power. This brutal campaign had its own logic. The continued violence made it clear that the Mughal and other local nobility could not completely suppress Sikh raids even with the assistance of the English. Given the deep competition between the Marathas and the East India Company in the northern India, sooner or later one group or the other would have to approach the Sikhs with a better offer, if only to restore revenue collection in the raided areas or to deny their rivals a coalition with the Sikhs.
Shaping Sikh identity through raiding and Rakhi, the early phase of Sikh expansion. The Chandausi raid was not the product of the Khalsa famine or the rising demand for military labor in North India alone. As we shall see, raiding had long occupied a central place in Punjabi culture as a means of building group cohesion. The role of the Khalsa were defenders of the dharam, and levying of Rakhi was linked to Sikh authority. The Sikh chief and those paying the tribute approximated the obligations of ruler and ruled. For those paying the Rakhi, however, this levy could be interpreted as a forced payment, one often extracted by implied or actual violence. Moreover, peasants resented multiple extractions of such claims, since by the second half of the 18th century, the areas subject to Rakhi by the Sikhs were sometimes also subject to revenue claims by other groups, Afghans, Marathas, or Mughals. Sikh groups saw themselves not as rebels, but as legitimate rulers and warriors who had proved their ability to rule through just conquest. By contrast, the opponents of the Sikhs characterized Rakhi practices as proof of the predatory nature of Sikh expansion and the chaos it created. This negative view of Rakhi is encountered in Mughal texts and colonial accounts of English officials such as William Franklin's. Unlike the Mughals, however, Franklin conceded that within the domains of the Sikhs there was considerable proof of prosperity and stability. Inured from their infancy to the hardships of a military life, the Sikhs are addicted to warfare in a manner peculiar to themselves alone. When determined to invade a neighboring province, they assemble at first a small number on the frontier when they have first demanded the Rakhi or tribute. If it be complied with, they retire peaceably, but when this is denied, hostilities commence, and then the Sikhs, in their progress, are accustomed to lay waste the country on all sides, carrying along with them as many of the inhabitants as they can take prisoners and all the cattle. The prisoners are detained as slaves unless redeemed by a pecuniary compensation. But though fond of plunder, the Sikhs in the interior parts of their country preserve good order and a regular government, and the cultivation of their lands is attended with much assiduity. Franklin's observations of the contrast between the seemingly ruthless practices of the Sikhs on their borderlands and the undeniable prosperity and good governance within their own territories was not a contradiction. The substantial wealth yielded from raids and more formal taxation arrangements was the primary resource that allowed even the less powerful Khalsa chiefs to maintain sizable armies. The Khalsa Sikhs demanded this tribute for the upkeep of their soldiers and Sikh institutions from the very early years of Sikh rebellion. Demands for Rakhi could also be framed as demands for money to be used for karha prasad. Karha prasad was food offered by Sikhs to their Gurudwaras, which then sanctified, was received back by worshippers as the physical embodiment of God's grace. Frequently, Sikh chiefs would frame their demands for money as sums to be used to glorify their gurus through the preparation and distribution of karha prasad. Such renaming of the sums demanded by the Sikhs also illustrates the intended recipients of these exactions. It was understood that the chief would not reserve the money collected for his own use. A considerable part of it was expected to be paid for his soldiers. The Sikh recruit was paid in other ways as well. after harvest time in grain or other produce in cash or from the revenue of specific lands allotted to certain fighting men. Plunder, however, remained an important part of the fighting soldiers' earnings. More important, generosity in the distribution of the Rakhi gathered or lands annexed could create strong bonds of patronage between the Sikh chief and his subordinates. The continuous raids and counter-raids between Sikhs of the Pulkian family in Malwa and the Muslim Bhattis discussed in the previous chapter were part of the endemic feuding between Jat and Bhatti groups that stretched back over a century. In this arid region, rivalry between these two groups over scarce water, pasturage, and cultivable lands gradually mutated into a war between Sikh Jats and Muslim Bhattis. This pattern of feuding has similarities with instances of banditry, violence, and civil war that often mark the relationships between closely related ethnic groups and tribes. Anthropologist Anton Bloch has referred to this kind of violence between similar groups of people as the narcissism of minor differences. Bloch argues violent confrontations usually take place between neighbors, friends, or relatives. In short, between people who share many social and cultural features. Bloch's premise is very useful when put in the context of Punjab's constant violence during the 18th century. It is a mostly overlooked detail in Punjabi history that Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs often shared common cultural notions and origin stories. For example, many of the Khalsa Sikhs Muslims' opponents claimed descent from the same Jat or nominally Rajput tribes as their Sikh counterparts. The line dividing martial tribes or castes such as Rajputs and peasant castes such as Jats was an ambiguous one in Punjab. When British census officials attempted to unravel the tribal and caste differences between Jats, Gujjar, Pathans, and Rajputs in the 19th century, they realized that each of these groups claimed common origins in their oral traditions. The frustrated census takers decided to reclassify groups on the basis of occupation. This practice would also lead to Sikh or Hindu groups such as the Sidhu Brahar Jats being classified as a caste, while neighboring Muslim groups such as the Bhattis were labeled tribes, although both groups had been pastoral nomads with similar oral stories about their origins. Turning to the constant violence between the Sikhs and their foes in the 18th century Punjab, we find that violence among Sikhs and between Sikhs and their rivals was often caused by competition for resources and was expressed through claims to a superior warrior status or divine favor. For example, the Pulkian chiefs and their rivals, the Bhattis, both claimed connections with the Sidhu Brahar tribes. The Pulkians, however, converted to Sikhism and Bhattis became Muslims. During their feuds in the 18th century, the Pulkian chiefs asked Sikh dals to come to their aid, and the Bhattis appealed to the Mughal Faujdar and other Muslim tribes. Such violence was framed within a language of martial honor, and at its barest core suggested might is right, but also that God only grants martial characteristics to those who are capable of pursuing them through hard times. Given the fact that the Sikhs and their local rivals shared overlapping identities, perhaps the religious differences in the 18th century should not surprise us. Such conflict often coexists with collaboration between related groups, and violence usually erupts in areas where states are unstable and where such groups no longer find protection from the state. Chaupa Singh's Rahitnama, written in the mid-18th century and later 19th century Sikh works like Ratan Singh Bhangu's Prachin Panth Prakash, often convey similar attempts at forging new social identities through organized violence. Chaupa Singh's Rahitnama explains that Guru Gobind Singh asked Khalsa Sikhs to always wear distinctive outward markers of their Khalsa identity so that they would be identifiable and could not shirk their duty. This duty, according to Singh, was to wage war. The master approves of warfare. It was for the purpose of waging war that he demanded his followers to retain the kish and take up arms. Only by warfare is the right to rule established. The supreme master stripped the Muslim rulers, Turks, of their authority and delivered it to the Panth. Their power has been destroyed. This text was completed at the height of religious violence in the middle of the 18th century. Here, there is an explicit reduction of the narcissism of minor differences into the obligation to participate in violence, as well as an attempt to forge a new martial identity. Making Khalsa culture, the honor feud as a marker of warrior identity. Feuding among Sikh chiefs often involved more than two missiles as the original combatants tried to garner support by building coalitions. The politics of narcissism of minor differences involved in such feuds were helpful in retaining the loyalties of commanders and soldiers at a time when the mobility of military labor was a disadvantage to minor chiefs with fewer resources. It is likely that the self-perception of Sikh chiefs as a new martial community made them particularly sensitive to attacks on their honor. To do otherwise was to display weakness that would leave one vulnerable to further attack. Although attacking another Sikh is scandalous, Sikh man who does not retaliate for an attack or an insult, one ran the danger of losing the loyalty and esteem of one's own soldiers and neighbors. Honor feuds thus would remain a central part of the evolving Khalsa identity. Despite attempts to rein in such self-destructive violence, internal feuds among Sikhs continued to proliferate throughout the 18th century. The Bansavali Nama of Kesar Singh Chibar, written in 1769, is strong in its condemnation of such behavior. In this text, feuding among Sikh chiefs is seen as a harbinger of the end time. The two terms are interesting of Singhi, not Sikhi. Singh plays with Singh, the last name adopted by all Khalsa men, and its literally meaning lion. It associates with the warrior's lion-like nature. Chibar implies that male lion Singh would not engage in Singhi feminine violence, and not a conduct expected of warriors of the faith, but it is proof of immorality and self-interest. Sikhs were Sikhs in name only, as they violated the core expectations of their faith, using violence for their own selfish ends. Sikhi, on the other hand, denotes complete fidelity to the teachings of the Gurus. A warrior who displays Sikhi will only undertake to fight for a morally defensible cause, such as fighting against Turks, whom he describes as demonic. Honor feuds, often conducted over worldly or trivial matters, could not meet this threshold. During one wedding between two different Sikh tribes, the groom's family brought along with them a lot of animals to pasture of the bride's family. Even though the land was under Hamir Singh, the ruler of Nabha's name, some officials attacked the men for these animals. And so the host of the wedding didn't do anything at the time, but then he had to feign illness later to grab the person responsible for the dishonorable treatment of the groom's party. At this point, the honor feud between the two states became more complicated, since the family at Nabha now attempted to get the senior head of the clan, Amar Singh of Patiala, to intervene on their behalf. Although Hamir Singh was eventually released, the bad blood occasioned by this incident among the Pulkian families continued for several years. At first glance, such feuds appear to be a waste of time and resources. Yet for Gajpat Singh to have ignored the insult offered to him by his kinsmen at such a vulnerable moment would also have resulted in a lowering of his esteem in the eyes of his own men. It would have resulted in the appearance of weakness and might have invited further attacks. Perhaps due to this understanding of masculine honor in local Punjabi culture, Gajpat Singh undertook to fight back. For a man surrounded by rival kinsmen, there was no other choice. For these reasons, many of the Jhangnamas prohibit violence against women, robbing the poor, or fighting as mercenaries. At a time when the enslavement of captives of war was common and the expanding military labor market offered profitable employment, such restrictions sought to distinguish the conduct of Khalsa Sikhs from that of other martial groups. Honor feuds served a similar logic if they did not share the moral reasoning of the authors. By displaying a readiness to defend his honor, his women, and his land, a chief publicly displayed his martial ability. By acknowledging their willingness to share the risks and rewards of such an undertaking, his men aligned their sense of honor and identity with that of their chief. Such local borrowings from popular notions of honor and loyalty were important to the Khalsa Sikh sense of honor. Honor, violence, and the ways of warriors. It is clear when examining sources on the 18th century warrior communities that a shared martial culture dominated contemporary understandings of war, raiding, and politics. Here it is useful to look once again at the views of an Afghan cleric, Al-Qadi Nur Muhammad, who was part of Ahmed Shah Abdali's raid of Punjab in 1764-65. When Nur Muhammad spoke of the campaign as a jihad, he also made it clear that he felt that the usurpation of Mughal rule by Sikhs and Marathas had diminished the pride and honor of all Muslims. Thus, through much of his Jhangnama, Nur Muhammad satisfied his sense of wounded pride by punning the word Singh and the Persian word for dog, Sak. Singh, the last name given to all Khalsa men, implied the Khalsa Sikhs' association with power, valor, and strength. Nur Muhammad mocked the Sikhs' pride in their warrior identity. Don't call the Singhs Sag, since they are in truth lions. Why would you call the men who are courageous lions in the battlefield dogs? They are soldiers who are like roaring lions. If you desire to learn the science of war, learn it from them. Nur Muhammad listed the warrior traits of the Sikhs that he found praiseworthy. Nur Muhammad viewed their ability to plunder the territories of other powerful chiefs, such as those in Multan, as further proof of their manliness and the workings of divine favor. The Qadi also reluctantly admitted that the Singhs were men of honor. They would never attack anyone who was considered to be na-mard, that is, an individual who is not a man. Mard being man, na-mard not a man. Their targets, according to Nur Muhammad, never included women. He implied that the Sikhs were supremely indifferent to women and treated all women as if they were buriyas or old hags. While Nur Muhammad described their looting with a touch of awe, he also pointed out that petty thievery or burglary is not a Sikh custom. He distinguished between raiding, an occupation he viewed as manly and praiseworthy, and thieving on a small scale which was contemptible. Here he appeared to be voicing the biases of the warrior aristocracy to which he belonged. Examining the Jhangnama, one gets the sense that Nur Muhammad made this distinction based on the fact that raiding involved two or more groups of people engaged in armed competition for resources and honor. While the contradictions in his thought are obvious, the Qadi's view on what he found admirable in Sikh Khalsa culture and manners are striking, which one considers that though much of the Jhangnama he refers to Sikhs in mostly pejorative terms. Clearly, even in the midst of constant feuding, Nur Muhammad recognized the common traits that he believed both Sikhs and Afghans shared as warriors. Nur Muhammad's account offers an important corrective to the way in which such primary sources have often been used and interpreted by scholars. Texts such as Jhangnama have been utilized as proof of the unity of Sikhs engaged in a religious war against the Mughals and Afghans. The conflicts of the mid-18th century have also been interpreted as a religious rebellion that progressed into a demand for sovereignty. Raids and Rakhi are viewed as a means of capturing resources available only to the state and its elite formally, and now redistributed among peasants within the Khalsa. By and large, historians working within categories of religious rebellion or banditry have associated a cohesive religious ideological motivation to Khalsa Sikhs. Even if there was such a brief period of cohesion, the cohesion fell apart rapidly once they acquired territory during the mid-18th century. The fluidity of group alliances rather than a rigid sense of community affiliations governed the behavior of warrior groups. Significantly, the evolving sense of martial honor was common to both the Khalsa and the Afghans, could as easily be deployed by Sikh or Afghan chiefs against each other as among themselves. The spiraling of honor feuds and vendettas among Sikhs in the second half of the 18th century worked on a similar principle and fragmented the internal cohesion of the Khalsa. The religious appeal to dharm could only provide a temporary sense of solidarity among chiefs and their followers. Thank you for listening. Take care. See you guys in the next history podcast.